Evaluation of the scientific status of neuroscience. Neuroscience is the science that concentrates on the brain and nervous system and how they affect our behavior, cognition, and emotions. In order to know more about the matter, we need to conduct researches. But there are different kinds of research methods, so which one is the most suitable to employ to achieve most accurate results, and by that, we will be able to say that the field of neuroscience is scientific and not pseudoscience. In this paper, I will argue that neuroscience is trying to be a scientific field, but it is unable to convince everyone of such claim because of pseudoscience, popular culture, and subjective biases. Background. The human brain has been studied only about 150 years ago, where the study was limited to direct observations and brain damage effect examining. But as time went on, neuroscientists developed different techniques and methods to study the brain, and with the help of technology, the mission became easier. Such methods included case studies, where this method is chosen because neurologically something happened to a subject and laboratory settings would not be applicable because the circumstances are unrepeatable. An example would be a case of brain damage where you can observe the influence of the damage on the person's behavior and according to this, create your own hypothesis. Another method would be screens, that refers to investigation of a gene that is responsible for biological processes, and cognitive neuroinvestigation that would be performed by putting a subject under a fMRI scanner to decide which area in the brain is activated when a stimulus is applied. A different method would be description, which is plainly an act of observing properties of the nervous system and describe them without employing manipulation. These two actions of investigation let us understand the connection between structure and function. An important method is manipulation, where you use it to test your hypothesis. In this technique, you manipulate the independent variable of X to see its effect on the dependent variable of Y. For example, would be removing part of the nervous system as an independent variable to see what happens, so you can decide which role it plays as a dependent variable. But we cannot isolate neuroscience from other disciplines that may help us to understand more how it functions. These fields may be psychology, biology, physiology, computer sciences, and others. An example of how neuroscience may need psychology can be illustrated in the area of psychopathology, where a disorder developed as a result of interaction between psychosocial factors and brain functioning, where the psychosocial elements influenced neurotransmitters releasing in the brain to the level of psychopathology. Pseudoscience vs. science. In order to claim that neuroscience is a scientific discipline, we need to prevent ourselves from engaging ourselves with pseudoscience, which is basically fake science, where Freud's psychoanalytic approach can form an example because it is not empirical, as it cannot be refuted/falsified. Religion and other supernatural preoccupations are also part of the term of pseudoscience. But it may be easy to say but hard to achieve, because nature of the human cognition is more ready and used to intuition and common sense than scientific concepts that may sound too complicated to believe until a strong evidence is suggested. An effect of confirmation bias may also take part of this initial mistrust in scientific claims, as people prefer to preserve their beliefs and sometimes to the level of searching and clinging to possible but not scientific evidences to assure their correctness. In other cases, they may bring the scientific information close to their intuitions to embrace it and by that distort it. But to be fair enough, also scientists themselves suffer from this effect and bias, but there is no need to worry as to that, because other scientists will doubt the scientific theory till persuaded that it was not biased. Other biases that may distract people from believing in science is claims of prestigious people and the act of conformation. So, it is important to mention that science and pseudoscience are basically cultural, and each has its own path. The path that science goes through starts within the scientific institutions and only later on arrives at the public, and if proved properly, it may be embraced by it. On that basis, in order to prevent ourselves from performing pseudoscience, we need to follow empirical rules that will bring more accurate knowledge, less biased, or based on intuition. But we cannot belittle the power of pseudoscientific schools that will fight to change the notion of being pseudoscientific to pure scientific, such in the case of defenders of the psychoanalytic approach. To illustrate the essence of the term science, we can use the procedure of empirical research to bring light to the subject. But such procedure is divided to two kinds: the quantitative and the qualitative. In quantitative research, we perform an experiment to prove a theory. Such experiment uses manipulation through the employment of two variables, the independent manipulated variable and the affected dependent variable. An example would be a theory that is being tested which claims that frustration leads to aggression. In this case, frustration is the manipulated independent variable and aggression is the affected dependent variable. A control group is employed but not manipulated as it will not be triggered to be frustrated, while the other manipulated experimented group is facing frustrating triggers to see the reaction. If the response is aggression, as hypothesized, then the theory is strengthened, if not, it will be refuted. This is basically taking a sample of a population and each member needs it fit the parameters of the described group. But the experiment needs also to be reliable in a sense that whenever the same experiment is carried out under the same conditions, the result would be the same. Another parameter would be validity of using the right medium to measure what it needs to measure. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is mainly describing the sample's demography. An example of a qualitative research may bring light to the subject where it dealt with male international students, Asian mainly, studying at a Canadian university. The research talks about the influence of their culture and gender as a reason for not admitting to health services although they suffered from depression. What is more relevant for us here is the method that was employed to investigate the phenomena, as we are trying to define what science really means. As the researchers decided on using qualitative research, they employed case study and personal interviews. The research describes how the researchers designed the research, preparing everything to its last details, from how they could bring the interviewees to participate in the research to training the interviewers how to ask and behave during the interview. Before the interviews, depression was measured employing the Beck Depression Inventory 2 that showed mild to moderate depression, and a data form was filled out by the participants. The interviewers were trained to use the qualitative data collection method, including noting gestures of the participants. After the phase of interviews and data collection, qualitative analysis of the data started, that fractured the findings to 3 codes, of causes and triggers that included brain chemistry, environment, and personal attributes among others. Such analysis supports the integrative approach that attributes different reasons for a psychological disorder that may include behavioral, biological, emotional, social, developmental, and genetic influences. Another empirical research that used the qualitative research method was about major depression disorder, MDD, of students of first year that were studying at the university. The research basically used similar methods of interview and procedures but employed different scales, measures, and interview approaches. They used the approach of encouraging students to fill out questionnaires and survey and participate in the study through interviews by announcements and urges coming from university employees. Popular culture, subjective biases, and ethical considerations. As an indication to the mentioned above, it is worth mentioning that the most powerful medium for popular culture is the media. And what the media reports to the public includes much of wrong scientific information, partly because the reporters themselves do not understand the scientific material. Science needs statistics and scientific methods to form as evidence and not intuition, because we are usually biased to the conclusions that we are seeking that may confirm our beliefs. On that basis, pseudoscience is also a sort of bias. Empirical evidence and scientific methods are needed if scientists want to preserve ethical considerations, as pseudoscience practicing may lead to breaching such duty, as the results of practicing pseudoscience may bring wrong treatment of patients. Opposing views. Not all pseudosciences ought to be suspended directly, as we may benefit from it sometimes. An example would be Freud's theory about unconsciousness. Drew Weston, 1999, argues that empirical experiments showed support to it in the dimension of unconscious cognitive processes, such in implicit memory where it is observable in behavior but brought to mind unconsciously, such playing a piano piece unconsciously, automatically, after consciously practicing it. Conclusion. It is obvious that science needs to be most accurate and based on evidence to convince the public of its correctness, as there are many factors as mentioned above, that will try to distort such notion. Whether it was coming from cognitive factors of people or environmental elements, such mission is not as easy as it may seem. It is also inevitable to conclude that neuroscience cannot live solely alone without the interference of psychology as it affects the functioning of the brain. An integrative approach is essential to understand better how it works. As it is the situation, neuroscience's status as a scientific discipline depends also on the status of the discipline of psychology as a scientific discipline. And this is the reason that we need psychology to be as scientific as possible, and in order to do so, we need to urge empirical researches and neglect pseudoscience. A claim of depending on brain images and laboratory work is enough for investigating the brain without involving environmental factors is not acceptable, as it was proven that environmental factors can even change structure of the brain. When genes that were responsible for the creation of the brain interact with the environment, vulnerable genes may be expressed when they face suitable environmental elements that may develop a psychopathological disorder. It is acceptable to conclude that the brain does not live in a vacuum but in a world of triggers, and sometimes very powerful, for example, traumatic events. It is in these incidents that the genes and the brain expose their ability to cope with hard experiences.